welcome to the show. I'm delighted to have you here.
Likewise.
I'm actually I'm very mesmerized by your background, I have to say. So it's an absolute privilege to have somebody with your expertise, not only in hospitality and food service, but also in marketing, because I love the marketing chats. So I'm delighted to have you here, and I was going to say shoot the shit, but like chit chat, whichever, and
It's
make it happen.
it's been a fun run, that's for sure. Yeah.
Exactly. And like I always ask my guests to introduce themselves, because I always joke that I have a habit of botching or underselling my guests' background. So do you mind telling us a bit about yourself, who you are, what you do, and most importantly, how you got to where you are today?
Yeah. So my background is in food. Obviously a clear love of food and all food that tastes delicious. So not really frozen vegetables, no offense to Jolly Green Giant, but mine has always been brands that are beloved and certainly readily enjoyed. I have a very different marketing background in terms of where I started. I started in operations and I started at 16 at Taco Bell.
Oh,
My
wow.
family could not afford college, but I had a really, really great leader who said, "Hey, when you turn 18, we're going to put you into a management program. Then we're going to have you run Taco Bell's on your own as a salary manager. And when you do that, PepsiCo will pay for 90% of your school." So that's what I did. I ran Taco Bell's during the day and went to school at night. Got my degree. Took me a little bit longer than most, but was able to get that by the help of PepsiCo. And then I've stayed in food pretty much ever since. If it's pizza, chips, or chicken, I've done it. And it's been a great fun run because of it. So whether that be obviously Pizza Hut, continuing with Yum, uh, working at Frito-Lay on
Yep.
the chips business and the food service business, and then going to both Wingstop and Raising Cane's, two incredibly fast-growing, fabulous brands.
That's awesome. And now you're at BAMarketing. Do you want to tell us a bit about that as well?
Well, that actually started after I left Raising Cane's. I
Yeah.
had a really, really great friend reach out and say, "Hey, would you please consider consulting?" So I've come into some situations and been able to help identify some challenges and then help outline a plan for them to go ahead and go forward. So it's been fun going in and finding the opportunities and being able to work across very different brands.
That's awesome. I mean, like you said, it's been quite a journey, and I didn't realize that about getting a Taco Bell and then getting into like a sort of management program there and
Yeah,
supporting you for college. I mean, that's phenomenal. I mean, you are the success story that those businesses want to talk about, like that,
yeah.
like opportunity. And I think that's one of the key ideologies of the hospitality business, is that like kind of anyone can make it with grit and determination.
I think that's the best thing. If you look across hospitality, food service in total, man, we are one of the most diverse education, race, age, gender across all. And I think that's what makes us special because we have so many different perspectives that come in.
Yeah, I mean it's phenomenal, and like I've had some people on this pod that started, were I had somebody on recently, and she was started as a housekeeper in like a hotel, and now she's like VP
Wow.
of HR in that business, and I'm like, it's a large hotel, you know, group portfolio, and I'm like,
Yeah.
you're the success. This is like the story that like people need to hear, because like I mean, there's just such a extreme hiring crisis in hospitality today, which I'm sure you're aware of, and be it at restaurants, hotels, clubs, bars, taverns, you name it, everyone is struggling to hire. And I think like, I had some people on, they were like, let's bring the sexy back, to the business. And it's like, yeah,
Yeah.
like as in, to be able to show that you can have a career in this business, like you get it out of it what you put in. And I think it's amazing to have you sitting in front of me here, Christina, because it's like you are the success, the literal embodiment of that success, which is amazing. And like I'm fanboying you here now, I have to say. Like I'm like, because I didn't know that. And I'm like, oh, my research was terrible.
No, no, no. It's interesting. Sorry, I just really my glasses I could barely start to see. What made it was the fact that somebody saw it because they saw something in me I didn't.
Yeah.
At the time, I would have been 17, come from a very small town, blue collar family, where I learned grit and hard work, most certainly, but somebody saw potential. And I think that's kind of our job is to find the potential and support it and really encourage.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think, that's the key thing is like identifying the talent and encouraging the talent. And I think,
Yeah,
now you've like evolved like your career, and you've been in leadership positions across the board. And like you were just telling me offline there that, you're pursuing a doctorate, in sort of like the imposter phenomenon, like as a leader being able to identify that in people. But I think it's important because it's like you just said that they saw me and
yeah,
they brought me into that program. I did something I didn't see myself, which is actually quite interesting as a parlay into this topic on like imposter phenomenon, because like, you know, like being able to identify that within oneself, like people realize it, they feel it, they kind of, it's like an internal vibe check. It's like kind of like interesting to me that like, almost that you kind of, that it was identified in you that you had the potential. And now
yeah,
it's like being able to identify on a high level what is the impact of like sort of the imposter phenomenon on women in the hospitality business, given that like, you know, I mean, the data is unbelievable in like, hospitality, that like what it's 49% of entry level roles in hospitality are women. And then less
yeah.
than what, 22% are in like executive positions or something. I mean,
I think
like,
you're exactly right. It's about 22% are VP and above
exactly.
in
And like,
C-suite.
what is the gap that like
Yeah,
why women are not getting into those positions? And, like I think your work, and I'm curious, we'll dive into it now, on the imposter phenomenon is probably in large part, I mean, there's probably like a lot of like real key insight here that will be able to help women in hospitality understand like more about themselves and like generate that kind of confidence effectively to like be able to like push themselves into those kind of roles in the way that you did.
yeah. It's interesting. So I'll back up and tell you, I always wanted to pursue my doctorate somehow, some way. Going back to when I was 16, it just took me this long to get to this life stage to be able to. So it may take me longer to pursue it than it did my first degree,
Yeah.
but certainly it's a passion. And as an executive program, it allows me to be able to bring that business perspective and the practitioner to the projects and to the research itself, which is how imposter phenomenon kind of popped up for me.
Yeah.
I have always been curious about human behavior. And I think as a marketer, you have to be curious about human behavior. Why do people do what they do, right? Like you're constantly asking, why do you put sauce on that way? Or why do you do that? And so for me, this became one of those because I'd never heard of it before. And it was about 9 years ago that I finally heard of it. Hold on one second. My headset is starting to move. I had
Yeah.
finally heard of it and was like, oh my God, that's what that is. And then in a group of about 20 women, you saw maybe 2 out of 20 didn't identify with it, but you had a lot that did. And so you
Yeah.
realized that you weren't the only one. So that's what's made me curious in terms of why. Why do people feel that way? How does that kind of come into being? And perhaps if we can understand it better, we won't have a negative association with it because you can't tell me you've so many successful leaders, male and female, Tom Hanks, Mark Cuban, Sheryl Sandberg, right? Like these really high performing leaders, and yet they have it.
Yeah.
So, what helps them overcome it? What gets past it? And I think once we can unlock that even greater, we'll be in a really incredible spot.
And I mean, I guess, like what, like, it's such an interesting kind of ideology. It's such an interesting thing. Like it's an interesting
Yeah,
phenomenon, really. Like you're saying, like I guess that it was like something like from Sigmund Freud in the 1930s, but you're saying it was only in the late 70s that it was like
yeah.
identified as something. And it's one of those ones that's like hard to describe, but you know when you see it. So do you want to like describe for us what is the imposter syndrome and imposter phenomenon, and like how does it manifest itself in women in hospitality in particular?
I'll give you how I summarize it or see it. There's really three key things that happen. One is when I'm in a room or I'm in this situation, I feel like a fake. The second one is when it comes to my success, I attribute it to luck. And the third is when it also comes to my success, I don't attribute it to my ability, right? So, two pieces to that. One is if I attribute it to luck, can I replicate it? Do I feel like I could do it again? And then if it's not my ability, what was it? was it an opportunity or situation? So they all kind of intermix
Yeah.
at that time. But I think the biggest one, if you start to really look at it, comes down to the success. And by and large, women tend to attribute their success to opportunities, situation, or luck, but their failures to themselves, right? So we internalize the failure, but we give all the credit to everything else. And I
Yeah.
think that's a really big opportunity for women overall, is when those moments happen to attribute it to their ability. And candidly, when they are recognized, to also learn how to say thank you and not feel like they have to deflect to everybody else. So it's not an or. It's not like I receive credit and my team doesn't. It
Yeah.
very easily can be an and. Thank you. I'm proud of the leadership I provided. And didn't my team do great? Right? Like those are ways that we can start to do that. And it really helps bring it into ourselves as well.
I do think it's very interesting that, like, you know, when it's a win and when it's a fail, and like how like women internalize that. You know, it's not saying that men don't also go through this as well. It's like
Right.
women are, I guess, more likely, or like they show more signs of internalizing the win and the fail in a different kind of way than men. Like, why do you think that is? Like, why do you think we're here in 2024 and this is something that we're talking about?
Gosh, I don't
Not an
know.
easy question.
I know. It's like, oh, that's a loaded question. Um, I don't know, but there's two things that I think are pretty interesting that should be further explored. One is recently there was a study that was published that talked about auditing performance reviews. And in particular, what they found is that when women were successful, their performance, their success was attributed to situations. Their failure was attributed to themselves. However, then in the same organization, their success was attributed to themselves and their failure was attributed to other things like goals were miscalculated or set too high, etc.
Yeah.
Now, the reason I bring that up is one, because once you know better, you can do better, right? So I think that's a key thing for all of us to make sure that we're giving the right credit and the right conversation where it's due. But then it begins to pose the question, do women not take credit for their success because that's what they're being told from their managers and their leaders? Or do managers and leaders not give credit because that's what they're getting as the feed and the feedback from the women, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know. I know that, you know, when you think about just how women societally or how we grow up, right, as girls, you know, it's play together, play nice, all the things. I think that that kind of plays into it as well, just seeing kind of how those roles kind of shape out.
Yeah, I mean, of course, there's a lot of nurture to this as well, and how kids are raised, you know, and I mean, like, we'll see how
Yeah.
this evolves over time, you know, because certainly, like, that has changed in terms of how kids play, how kids like identify, how kids, whichever. I mean, like, I guess we're in for a very interesting time when, what do they call them? Like, what's the alpha or whatever? Gen
Gen
Alpha,
Alpha,
Gen
followed
Alpha.
by Gen Beta. Yeah. And Gen
Oh,
Alpha
Gen Beta
hasn't
exists
been
now.
born yet. Yeah. Yeah. I think
Okay.
after 2025, it becomes Gen Beta. Yeah.
Oh God. Okay. Cool. It's
Yeah.
all not stop. I'm what they call a geriatric millennial now. That's what I'm called. So I'm very much like, I still use the laughing crying emoji. And
I,
I think thumbs up is not passive aggressive, although Gen Z apparently says that. So, you know, we have a lot to learn.
that's
But
funny.
yeah, comic relief.
Yeah.
But the reason why I say that is, you know, like, a lot of it is the nurture of like the way we've kind of grown up. And I think
Yeah.
like one of the kind of key sort of like, I guess, like, news media narratives around like the way kids are growing up is like, you know, millennials are soft, and they, you know, like, we have these sort of like viewpoints on certain generations. But what I would say is that, like, you know, these conversations are happening in large enterprise in the United States, you know what I mean? Like in corporate
Yeah.
America, like, how do we solve for diversity, equity, inclusion? Like, I mean, like, these are actual conversations that have been happening for 10, 15 years, and companies are failing and companies are succeeding in it. But like, there is
Yeah.
a voice to it now, you know, in a way that there wasn't 20 years ago or in the late 90s. These were not really topics that people were kind of discussing in any real sort of formal capacity. And I think it's like amazing for somebody like you who's kind of come up through Taco Bell in a leadership management program, got yourself into Pepsi because of that, found your way through that all the way up to Wingstop and into Raising Cane's, and now you're operating as a sort of like expert consultant in the space of marketing. And I'm like, yeah, like, talking about like the imposter phenomenon, and you like really like researching into that as an unlock for women's potential in the workplace, in particular in hospitality, is like such key work. Because in this series that I've had, I mean, like every woman I've had on the pod has been like phenomenal, and everyone has an amazing point of view. And I'm like, more and more of that is needed in like senior leadership positions to like identify. Because one of the key things that I definitely noticed, I'm curious your take, everyone I've had on has been like, there were women in positions that like inspired me, and thus I feel like I'm an inspiration, hopefully, to women who are coming through, that they could potentially look like and be like me. Is that something that you feel? Is that like something that you carry in the way you operate as well?
Uh, Most certainly. And it's interesting you say that, because if I go back, um, I had never seen a female in a leadership role until I was about 19. And at that time, Julia Stewart was operations lead for Taco Bell. Now, my grandmother and my mother are very strong and very powerful, but not to have a role where they
Yeah.
had a voice or a seat at the table, right? So I think that's the difference in it. But I'd never seen one before. Right.
Yeah.
So that was a really big transformational time. And I think at that time, just to give some context, women managers were still wearing the men's ties, right? Like part of our uniform. So women's shirts did not even exist, right?
Yeah.
So now you have this very powerful, very skilled, adept woman walking into a room and being able to lead, and it was fascinating to see. So when you asked, I hope to be a role model. I hope so.
Yeah.
I would hope that I would. I have two boys. I hope I'm also a role model to them as well. And the biggest thing I'd say is I think there's just an overall humanity component of just don't be an asshole. Right at the end of the day,
Hallelujah.
it just comes down to that.
Yeah.
And if you then I think it becomes kind of a non-issue. When it comes specifically in terms of putting leaders in the right places, which I'm a big fan of, I also go back to the data. And McKinsey very clearly outlined that brands or organizations that have diversity outperform those that don't, not only in top line, but also bottom line. And so if I think of asking a business leader, do you want to grow? Would you like to perform? Then here's one of the attributes that can be correlated back to their success. And it has to do with diversity across the leadership team. I'm the same way, and I believe it goes both ways.
It's actually, it's amazing you referenced that, because like I've kind of brought that up on the pod a few times, but it's interesting. Like I would you like to hear some data that would support that? I've got some, I think it's important,
Yeah.
and an important interjection, but I like to say this.
Yeah.
This is from BCG, okay? And it's basically like based on data from 27,000 employees in 16 countries, okay? And for focusing on DE&I initiatives. Now, DE&I doesn't just mean African American to anybody just listening here. It is literally diversity, equity, and inclusion of all people, irrespective of color, creed, whichever.
Yeah.
And what it says here: attracting talent. BCG shows that almost 1/3 of people from underrepresented groups choose not to apply for or accept a position in companies that do not have inclusive work cultures. Leadership that prioritizes inclusion in the workplace can slash attrition risk by 50%. That's because employees who witness or experience discrimination, bias, or disrespect are nearly 1.4 times more likely to quit their job. And companies with an above average diversity on their management teams also report innovation revenue 19 percentage points higher than companies with below average leadership diversity. And it's like, and that's the thing. I think when I hear this, first of all, I always like to stress to people that DE&I is not just an African-American thing, irrespective of what the sort of national news media narrative and its toxicity that exists within the narrative. Because if you put the three words together or said them individually, you'd be like, why would any company not want to have diversity, equity, or inclusion in any sort of format of like the way they work? It's just beyond me that people will find that in any way, shape, or form, like kind of, repulsive, or whatever phrase they want to use. And it also includes all types of people, not just like African Americans. And so the fact that there is like formal research has been put into this.
Yeah.
And we know that these companies outperform others when they have diversity in the leadership, women, people of color, different races, creeds, whichever, than not.
Yeah.
And I'm like, here we are in 2024, and we see the McKinsey data that says entry level is 49% women, and then less than 23% is in leadership positions is like women today. And I find that just one of those peculiar corporate America anomalies. But I guess if you were to look at that research from, I have no idea what that would have been in 1999, but I would imagine it would be
Probably a little bit lower.
and I suppose, the revolution takes time,
Yeah.
what, like the imposter phenomenon, for example, it's actually very close to me. Like we were saying this just offline, like I was saying it to my girlfriend, like she was saying it to me, you know what I mean? And it's like, it's so pervasive, like I'm like, is it pervasive because people now know what it is, in a way that like before people didn't know what they were feeling? Do you know what I mean? Like, you don't know what
Yeah.
it is inside of you. You're just like, oh, like, I don't know what it.
Yeah. I think there is something to that, right? Like all of a sudden, once you know it, you can recognize it. Or we used to call it fake it till you make it, which in a lot of ways actually just perpetuates the feeling, right? Because I'm
Yeah.
faking it being the number one thing that defines whether you have it. What's interesting is during, as I've been reading and doing the research, over 70% of adults have felt it. It is not gender discriminant. It is not race. It is not age. It is not education. It happens and it's universally applicable. So it's not a female issue or a male issue. It's kind of pervasive, as you mentioned, it across all of us. The one thing that does begin to separate it or begins to define it is when somebody is the only one or the first one, right? So that does correlate in terms of I'm the first to go to college in my family.
Yeah.
Therefore, it feels abnormal. It's not, not a new, it's a new situation. I look around and I'm the only female on the board.
Yeah.
Right. So that is what it does tend to come up, or that you can see a correlation to. But other than that, no, it's out there for all of us to enjoy across the board.
No, totally. And I mean, like, what's interesting? I had an interesting quote from somebody on the pod, and she's a senior director of training at Crystal Restaurants, and she was saying to me that like Dee and I, or like trying to like solve all these sort of like gender disparities in the workplace. It's not necessarily mean we kick somebody out and put somebody else in. It's like on the table. It's like, how do we pull up another chair? And I was like, oh, okay. That's actually a great way of thinking about it. It's like, we're not asking to exclude anybody else.
Right.
It's just like, can we pull up another chair, please?
Yeah, I heard it referenced one time in terms of it's not a zero-sum game.
Yes.
The way I like to think of it, because I like food, is it's not pie. We're not trying to cut a fixed space into a lot of pieces. We can make it cake. We can go up, we can go out, we can do all sorts of things to, bring everybody in. But I agree, it's not if I win, you lose. It's just the opposite, which is how do we win together? And I think going back to, I want to find the best people to really make my team as strong as it can be. And I'm going to, really embrace and look for them to add value or contribute are two key components.
Totally. I mean, I guess, like when is your doctorate? When are you finishing your doctorate?
Oh my gosh. So it is an executive program, which means my Saturday mornings. Some people run marathons, not me. I choose to read research,
That's good.
or learn how to play golf.
I'm sick of Instagram marathoners. I'm over that now. Everyone I know is a marathoner now.
Look, if you see me running, you better run because there's a problem. I can assure you. So it'll take me a little bit of time to complete as I just chip away at it. But I'm hoping by 2026 it'll be complete. But it again, human behavior. If you know this now about 70% of the population, if you start to see it, just imagine what brands can do to help reinforce, that confidence or that, really making people, human beings, feel good. There's a fine line between confidence and arrogance. And I think that confidence is really pretty powerful.
Totally. I mean, if my missus was here, she'd be like, Alex, you very much straddle that line between confidence and arrogance. Self-awareness, self-awareness. But I think you're dead right. And I mean, like, there's a huge opportunity for brands here, and it's like, this sort of quest for bottom line that we see on a quarterly basis is one thing. And then it's like, just great leaders need to lead here. Like, I think that's the thing. And you see it in the food service business. People talk about like female-led businesses, like, is it Whataburger as like the very famous example? It's like an all-female leadership team there, and they're absolutely crushing it. And it's just like, look, the results are there. Like we just mentioned the BCG result, the BCG. That acronym is so annoying. I'm so glad I never worked there. It just doesn't roll off my tongue. The BCG research, like, it shows like bottom line impact will happen, and I guess it's like making people aware and making people cognizant of these facts. Like, I don't think there's a sort of maliciousness in the marketplace. You know what I mean? I think there's just an existing structural bias that exists. And, when you hear like people talk about like, fun fact about Ozempic, wasn't it that it was only tested, like the majority of people that they tested the weight loss on was on men and not on women. So we don't really know the impact that medication will actually have on women, for example. It's a lot of like societal structural biases exist around us. And so it's not an attack on people to hear any of this stuff. You know what I mean? It's just like the proof is in the data, and it's just uncovering those rocks, having those conversations, and having the foresight and the leadership to like bring them to the fore and make them sort of initiatives that like will provide value for businesses, will provide value for the people that are working there, and engender, a real hospitable culture for everybody,
Yeah. And I think that goes back to, I want the best and I want to win. Right.
Yeah.
And that kind of guides, how you think of talent and talent selection. I do think that there are things that can be done to also just make leaders feel more welcome or part. So a couple things that always come to mind, and I've had some fabulous leaders, and am very fortunate to have some really, really great friendships. And you see it. If you've ever met Maria Rivera from Small Sliders, man, she's amazing. If she defines badass in so many ways, or Jackie Woodward, who was just with Bojangles as their CMO, like transformational in a lot of ways. But there's a couple things that those leaders do, or I've had some fabulous male leaders as well. One is they make sure you're in the room, right? So you're in the room. You're also at the table, right? If you watch coming into board meetings and coming into meeting rooms, watch where people sit and make sure that there's a chair, like pull up a chair, add another chair to the table, right? It's not taking somebody's spot. Make sure they're in the conversation, right? Because that way they're speaking up and adding value. And most importantly, the strongest thing I've ever seen done is when somebody's interrupted, and this is male or female, it just tends to happen sometimes more to females, where another person says, hold on, we'll get to your comment in a second. I want to hear what Alex has to say. I want them to finish their thought, right? And that kind of goes back to just don't be an asshole.
Yeah, it's like manners,
It's like the foundational components, but those things and doing those actions really help bring out anybody who's coming into the room, especially if it's their first time, or if it's not an everyday occurrence for them. And I think those are some key things for us to do.
Totally. And I mean, that's like, really helpful advice as well. And I think like as leaders, like whether you're like, up and coming middle management to, director, it's like being mindful and not being an asshole. I mean, who knew that being mindful and not being an asshole was like a good way to like make things happen? But it's like, being conscious of the people that you hire and the people that you have in your team, and being cognizant of their behavior, whether, some people are slightly more reticent than others. Some people are more quiet, like how do you bring them into the conversation? How do you shut down the loudmouth like this guy?
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, as in,
I think that's the interesting thing. We've all been there, right? Yeah. I've been the one who's interrupted. I've been the one who's done it. I'm not proud of it, but I recognize it now. I think that there's one other thing that tends to happen, and it can happen at various life stages, is leaders make assumptions for their employees. Like, oh, he's not going to want that role because his wife just had a baby. Or, we're making assumptions for them instead of giving them the option to select in or select out. And
Yeah.
I learned that lesson by an incredible leader of R&D at Frito-Lay, where he was like, now, Christina, you're making a decision for them. And it was important to hear and it hurt to hear, but he was absolutely right. I was.
Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating. You know what I mean? And it's like, and all this comes with experience as well. You know what I mean? And it's just like a tolerance for like, okay, live, learn,
Yeah.
improve. You know what I mean? And that's kind of what it is, you know? And it's like, this is why I think having this podcast and having this conversation is so helpful, because it's like we're able to like have this and hopefully people listen to
Yeah.
it and they go, yeah, like this isn't, none of this is like rocket science. Do you know what I mean? Like that's the mind blowing thing about this. It's like talking about it cogently, talking about it in a way that makes sense. You know, it's very practical, and it's like not like you're going to have to upend an organization to really improve this. And I think that's the thing that people need to realize. Like this is like, you know, the improvement you can make in culture and morale, you know, and the way that people like collaborate, you know, the way that people kind of work together. I mean, like, it's not asking for much, just to be mindful and to be like, not like you said, like an asshole. Do you know what I mean?
Which sounds so terrible. I know that there are better ways to say it.
Hey, I love a good R rating on my podcast, you know.
Well, then you're lucky to have me, because that'll definitely be what I'll say. I think it is fundamental, but I think when it's challenging or when it's uncomfortable is when we have to commit
Yeah.
at the same time. Um, and I think that's the hardest part is getting that commitment and
Yeah,
making sure that
totally.
you've got it. And you see incredible organizations. Granted, I have been fortunate to be a part of probably well, I don't know, the best,
Yeah.
especially related to how they operate and the way that they treat members of their team and their leadership. But I also recognize that that's not the case for all. It
Yeah.
doesn't mean that it can't be. Again, it's not pie. It's not a zero sum game. There's ways to win.
Yeah, totally. And then I guess, you know, because I mean, like, I love that we've had a great conversation on this, and I know there's another, I know there's another topic that we want to like kind of touch on. You know,
Yeah.
given this is actually quite funny, because usually when I have marketers in the pod, we just, you know, like have a great chat around marketing, and I'm like, I love that, like we're so invested in this topic that it's
Yeah.
like, yeah, like the marketing can come to the end, it's fine. But like, you know, you did say something interesting, you know, about like two types of marketers, because I have many strong opinions on the types of marketers that exist out there. But you said that there are two types of marketers. There's the GM and there's the brand purist. And I love the phrase brand purist, frankly. But like, tell me what you mean by like there's two different types, and like, yeah, just tell me why you think there are two different types.
Yeah, and I realize that it sounds like hard and fast, right? In terms of like there's an identity or definition. But for,
Nuance.
for me, what a GM focuses on is on the long-term sustainable growth, both the business and the brand. And I have many friends that are brand purists, and they are incredible, right, at
Yeah.
building the brand. But that balance of the brand and the business is really where the magic starts to happen. And probably because I came from operations, I'm very keen on don't create demand you can't support, right? Like the brand is everything. It
Yeah.
is, if I think of a restaurant, it is, is there trash in the parking lot? All the way down to, what was the advertising campaign? And having that holistic view to me
Totally.
is a GM mindset versus focus specifically on the advertising component to it, right?
I think, you know, it's interesting because obviously coming from like say large brands, you know what I mean? Like there is that sort of delineation where you got people very responsible for like the sort of like big kind of Super Bowl moments, or those kind of like large kind of ads, or you know, whichever,
Yeah.
that probably don't really care about the rest of it. Hopefully we get a Clio award. Hopefully we go to Cannes and get a line. You know what I mean?
Right.
It's like there's
Right.
that versus like, to your point, I think like the GM, and it's interesting you phrase it as a GM, because I think the GM phrasing of it kind of almost undersells it. Like it's like a marketing ops leader or something, because it's like, you know, your response, like the brand is like when you walk into like XYZ restaurant and it's dirty, you're like, I'm not going back there. And,
Right.
or you see a price go viral on Twitter
Right.
and people are like, I'm not going there because it's so expensive, even though the individual prices are different in every different franchise. You know, so
Right.
it's like your brand is so many things that's consumed in so many different ways. And I think like, you know, this is why you see brands in like Fortnite. You know what I mean? Like people are like they're like creating worlds inside these places because this is where people are there, and it's like if that's the world they're going to engage, we got to be there. And I find it very
Yeah,
fascinating to like because it's very comprehensive and it's very like you have to think about every single thing about why somebody would want to love your brand, which is like
right.
amazing. You know what I mean?
Which goes back to the fundamental of human behavior and motivation,
Yes.
right? And again, I've had people on my teams, and I've worked with those that are really big into the, I'm going to say, the brand purist side. I had to know how to motivate them, right? Because my style is different than their style. It doesn't mean that it's less valuable. It just means it's different, or that, mine is less valuable. It's just different. But the combination of those two is critically important. I do think this is why you're starting to see some really, really incredible marketers moving into CEO and president roles.
About
Right.
time,
So,
frankly.
right. I mean, I just recently, Carl Laredo was announced for president of Pizza Hut. I worked with Carl. We worked at Frito-Lay together, right?
Yeah.
So you see some really incredible leaders that Jeff Klein at Popeyes, right? Like you see all these starting to
Yeah.
come together, and it's because they have a foundation in marketing, which always goes back to the basic understanding of why do people love my brand and why do they want to spend money on it and what do they say about it?
And it's amazing. And I think it's great to see that more marketing professionals are like scaling into leadership positions
Yeah,
because I think the overarching narrative about people in marketing is that we don't last longer than a year in a job. And so
yeah,
2 years here. But what I
yeah,
bucking trends. But what I was saying is like, it's interesting because I think I think it's not that there's been like a sort of like backlash to data, but I think that there is an absolute acceptance of like this sort of human-centric type marketing. And even saying human-centric is just the most waffly businessy kind of thing possible. And having been responsible for a lot of that narrative in
yeah,
my earlier part of my career, I apologize to everybody. But what I mean is like the sort of human focus, like, designing from human first principles, like if you're going to create like a piece of food, like why would somebody even want to eat it in the first place? And like thinking about that entire journey, just
yeah,
like I think we've had for a long time, like we spend X, we get Y. And I don't really care what happens in the middle. You know what I mean? And it's
yeah,
like, no, it's like, why? Like, there are brands like you're at Raising Cane's, and that thing went supernova over the last couple of years. And it's like, there's more
yeah.
to this than simply just selling chicken tenders. Do you know what I
And it's
mean?
a
Like,
lot of chicken. Yeah,
yeah, it's a lot of chicken. But like, I think, the fundamentals of it though, like, that brand sells just chicken tenders. It sells a
yes,
type of, I can't even remember what it says, fried, like a type of fries, like a Texas bread was the thing I ate for the first
yeah,
time. And
yeah,
there's only so many items in the menu. You know what I mean? And it's like, and the brand though. So like the product is the brand as much as the brand is the product. You know what I mean? And that's like
it is.
so much to it. And it's like amazing to me. Like that, like this type of like niche product, like a fundamentally like a chicken tender, like niche, like of all the meats and all the foods that we eat,
Yeah,
like that you would traditionally associate with going out for like, QSR or like fast casual or whatever,
yeah.
is now like I think the founder of Raising Cane's, is he the richest person in his state? I think I saw or something. Like
I'm not going to speak to his bank account, but Todd Graves is a
yeah.
genius in
There
so
was
many ways and
I
a
think he is
kind
the richest person in
being.
the state though. I think I saw like a
He,
TikTok
he
like
might be. Yeah,
which chicken.
yeah.
That's a lot of chicken.
And I will say that Kane is adorable. The dog
Yeah.
herself is quite adorable. But I think the magic of what Todd has done is stayed consistent, right? Like it is chicken, toast, fries, slaw, and
So yeah.
sauce, right? Like, and that's the fundamentals. And he's stayed consistent and he stayed on brand. And that's largely he's a prominent and active founder in the brand.
Yeah.
And I think that makes a big difference too.
And I think, like from a marketing perspective though as well. I mean, and I guess you could kind of say the same about Wingstop. I mean, because they both like have just enormous like brand profiles now and like scaling
Yeah,
like crazy, and you've been part of them, is that type of consistency, which is interesting from a marketing perspective because, like when new leadership comes in, and you've definitely been through this. I mean, I have. We're in a new brand, like new colors, new way of just saying who we are. And it's funny in technology, like how brands get so lost when they add new features and products. Like, I mean, I saw a very funny thing that was like Asana, Slack, whatever. And it's like what they originally like pitched themselves as to what they are today. And it's like, what do
Yeah,
they do? Like what? Weren't they like a messaging app or something? Do you know what I mean? It's like the
exactly.
messaging is so confusing now because they have so many products that they're kind of shilling, I guess. You know what I mean? Whereas this just shows the value of being consistent with your values of your product.
And I think that kind of goes back to the consumer really owning the brand, right? To a large part. Um, I remember I was moving on to a brand at Frito-Lay because you often rotate to different brands. And I was
Yep.
coming on to one and I sat down with the design team. And they were like, hey, do you want to change the packaging? I'm like, is there something wrong with it? And they're like, well, no, but most marketing leaders when they come in want to change the packaging. And I'm like, but if I change it, it's not going to be better. It's just going to be different.
Yeah.
Right. And I think really understanding in terms of where do you leave your mark and where do you really create change from a brand in a much bigger perspective than something that you can physically see is the greatest value you can bring. And that goes to adding value to the business, not
Yeah.
just to the marketing side.
Well, isn't that where everybody gets confused within marketing departments is that it's like, oh, we can do marketing, but like, what's it actually doing for the business?
Right.
Like I remember
Yeah.
back in the day, I worked in media and I remember Coke was a client. So we were obviously a large enough agency. And I remember, I remember sitting in a meeting and I was like, what's the goal? Like, what are we doing here? And it was like, we have to sell 500 million bottles of Coke in the UK this year.
Yeah.
That's the goal. And it was like, okay, I guess we have to spend this much budget and figure out how to drive that amount of sales. And that's kind of like the goal. And then it's like everything kind of works back from that. And I was like,
Right.
at that level, at that scale, you know what I mean? That's a lot of
It
Coca-Cola,
is.
and it's like,
Yeah. And I think, the best thing about PepsiCo was the discipline, right? In terms of how
yeah,
you start to think of things question wise, not necessarily always process, right? Because you want to avoid bureaucracy, but understanding what is the business problem to solve,
yeah,
what is my marketing problem to solve, and how do I have to change behavior, right? Like just getting down to the fundamentals, or as David Novak used to say, what habit, perception, or belief do I want to create, change, or reinforce, right? Like
yeah.
I learned that in my early 20s from David, right? So you start to remember
That's
these things.
it. Exactly.
I think where leaders who aren't familiar with marketing or don't understand its power, where you get confused is when they come in and they say, just give me a big idea. Giving a big idea is like opening up a giant box with no direction. However, if you tell me I'm to sell 500 million bottles of Coke, then I can start to work from there and get creative in terms of, well, why can't I? Why am I not? What would it
Yeah,
take? And start to really hone in on some big ideas. But if you're just waiting for marketing to bring you a big idea, then you're missing the connection and the
totally.
true opportunity from business leadership.
I mean, that's it exactly, and I think this is an exciting time for all of these brands now, like you said, because they have like marketing leaders with the customer solely like mind, I guess like, you see like corporate America fails all the time with this, with different types of leaders in different positions that are just not
Yeah,
capturing like what their customer is, and not being able to speak to it. And you see brands that just are not connecting and you're
yeah,
like, why are they not connecting? I had somebody on here who was was a former CEO of like an ice cream brand, like 98-year-old ice cream brand. And it's the kind of place you would have gone with your parents and they would have gone with their parents and whichever. And it's
yeah,
like very much struggling now. And it's like, yeah, it's not connecting with how
yeah,
somebody wants to consume like that product anymore, like consume ice cream. And it's like, that's a brand problem. That's a product problem, menu problem, like four walls problem. But like,
yeah,
they're all easily identifiable. So it's like, okay, like what are we going to do to like get these people back in, like I think it's very interesting as well with the sort of like hyper fragmentation of fast casual now, and that we have multiple
mhm,
layers of what is like say QSR, what's FSR, what is like fast casual, what's elevated. They're kind of that those lines are like
yeah,
blurring now as well in the space. And
yeah,
so it's like I think that gives brands an enormous right to play, especially if you want to punch up, like if you're like a Raising Cane's, it's probably a bad example, but like say Five Guys, which is like objectively famously kind of more expensive than sort of like others for what
yeah,
they do, it gives you a right to play in different kind of spaces by like designing your brand to play and speak to those kinds of audiences, and people will return that favor by going in and buying your product,
right,
like I think it's a very exciting time. I mean, you obviously do because that's what you do for a living. But from my vantage, I'm looking at all these blurring of lines, and I'm like, oh, if anybody wants to step in, there's a right to play for anybody.
Where I give a really great example of that is Chili's.
Love
If you've
Chili's.
seen how they've picked George Felix, obviously a wonderful human being and great leader, great marketer, they've stepped in when the social started posting about a Big Mac is more expensive than going to Chili's for their
Lean
cheeseburger,
in.
right? Like you start to see that in terms of that's a big change between QSR to full service. But they certainly that door opened and they were able to go in there and really make it happen. I think one of the things that marketing leaders bring, especially if I think of more brand leadership roles overall, nothing happens in marketing by itself, right? We work with
Tell
agencies,
me
we
about
work
it.
with media teams, we work with R&D, we work across finance. And I think that collaboration that is usually driven through marketing or part of really makes it special. Now, I'm not saying marketers aren't special because we do like to do our own things and beat to our own drums and have our own identity. But at the same time, we do cross over every function that exists within an organization. And being able to tap into that is powerful.
I mean, exactly. I think like, and it's an interesting kind of moment for marketing on that because it's like, what is the future facing role of marketing if it is
Right?
really an extremely cross functional department in a way that other departments don't necessarily like engage? You know what I mean? Like, there's so much riding on making marketing like happen in the first place. Like, if
Yeah.
you're like, like if you're like a Pepsi, I mean, like, and you're going to launch a campaign for like a Super Bowl campaign, you're doing that a year in advance. You know what I mean? There's a lot of time goes into the preparation of making these. It's almost
Yeah.
like a movie production. You know what I mean? And then I'm not just talking about Super Bowl ad, obviously famously is a Pepsi thing, but like,
Yeah.
like any kind of brand, like, I mean, like doing these launches, like, I mean, I've been part to a lot of them myself, and I like, like you said, it's not just internal stakeholders, it's all the external stakeholders that are involved as well. And then you have like just the enormous downward pressure on pricing that is necessary
Right.
in like every sort of procurement process for agency and media buying and everything else. And then it's like the ROI on the whole campaign in the first place. And then the suite of professionals that you need to hire to help you understand the lift of what you're doing.
Right.
It is like a production. And I think like this is an interesting time because you have upstart brands. Raising Cane's is not an upstart anymore, frankly, but like in the sense that it ain't the size of like say Pepsi, you know what I mean? But like
Right.
the rules of engagement have changed for marketing now. And I think your
Yeah.
point of like Chili's kind of going after that McDonald's burger thing, it's like, yeah, moment marketing is a thing now. Like you can capture, like, how do you capture that trend? How do you come after that trend?
Right.
How dynamic is your team? Because like the point I was making is like, you talk about like, say, like, traditional sort of marketing departments like that are like holy grail sort of grad roles, holy grail sort of professional roles, like being Pepsi, being like American Express, these kind of big brands that like, really kind of like lean into like sort of like kind of career marketers.
Yeah.
That's kind of changing now. You know what I mean? Like, as in the sense that like, okay, no, like you can be like you said, Chili's, and you can make, how dynamic could a Pepsi be through like say all the compliance and legal and everything else to like jump on an opportunity to kind of go after that sort of, that message that the Chili's are like, fuck it, we're doing it. You know what I mean? Like, it's like you can make that happen.
Yeah. And I think the interesting piece to it, and I've been fortunate to work on a lot of brands, even
Yeah.
within PepsiCo, that were very responsive. I have a personal philosophy, which is you have to be intentionally agile,
Yeah.
meaning that there are fundamentals that still have to take place so that you can respond because you have to know what you're saying no to, right?
Yeah.
Or what you're giving up to be able to move in that way. The famous one was always, well, we should just pivot. I'm like, if you pivot too many times, you're spinning in a circle,
Yeah.
right? So you have to be like not bureaucratic, but at least strategically minded in terms of why you're making the choices that you are. And
Yeah.
that can literally be a 30-second process. It doesn't need to be a 30-month process,
Yeah.
right? And I think being able to do that, I've had a blast doing that on brands, whether it be Cheetos. obviously, working on Super Bowl,
Yeah.
which was fun for Frito-Lay and Pepsi, and then, Raising Cane's and Wingstop. Those are two fabulous examples about brands that are growing and being incredibly integrated into culture.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I can think of no better way to sign off the pod. Like ending on culture. It was such a human-centric conversation. So I think ending on
Very
that.
much so. Very much
But
so.
Christina, thank you so much. This was
Thank
fabulous.
you.
This was a
I
fabulous
appreciate it.
conversation. This was phenomenal. I appreciated every second of it.
Thank you.